They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? They cry out for justice. This is called an imprecatory prayer, a prayer that says God harmed somebody because they did this. Well, there's a rich tradition of this throughout the Bible. We'll look at a few examples. Psalm 35, let them be like chaff before the wind, with the angel of the Lord driving them away. Let their way be dark and slippery. Here's one that the New Testament writers apply to Judas Iscariot. Psalm 109, may his days be few. May another take his office. May his children be fatherless and his wife a widow. And some folks will say, yeah, but that's the Old Testament, and maybe that's the book of Revelation being a little bit weird. But Jesus would never approve such forms of prayer. Well, this isn't so. In Luke 18, Jesus is teaching on prayer, and he gives the parable of the persistent widow who comes to the judge of the town, and she's always demanding justice. She says, give me justice against my adversary. And after she's nearly blackened his eye, he finally decides to do it. Well, Jesus then interprets the meaning of the parable for his disciples. And will not God give justice to his elect, who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily. Imprecatory prayer in the Psalms, imprecatory prayer with Jesus, imprecatory prayer in heaven at the base of the altar. There is a place in the Christian experience for bringing your griefs to the Lord that there has not been proper justice in the earth, and asking him and expecting him to bring about justice. Miroslav Volf was a theologian who lived through the hellish war in Bosnia. His friends and neighbors suffered unspeakable horrors, and in his book Exclusion and Embrace, he argues that in the Balkans, post-communist disbelief in a God who avenges wrongdoing led to an overflow of violence. About 14% of the population was Christian. But after the influence of communism, they became a very liberal type of Christian. And they suffered rapes, and they returned rapes. They suffered murders, they returned murders. And Wolf was there as a theologian and as a pastor type, and he was trying to diagnose the problem. If we live in a sun-scorched land, soaked in the blood of the innocent, and doubt that God will bring ultimate justice, then we will scarcely be able to resist taking up the sword ourselves. Injustice needs an answer. In other words, liberal Christians had decided that the reason Jesus tells us to turn the other cheek, to harm our enemies, to not bear arms against them, these sorts of teachings that you find in the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere, they said the reason he is like this is because God himself does not bear the sword. God is, the nice one in heaven who tolerates and puts up with everybody. And Wolf says, when you believe that, when you subscribe to liberal Christianity and terrible injustice comes to you, you can't accept it anymore because you know that there should be some type of justice. And so you go out and you do it yourself. And these Christians became guilty of doing terrible things. And he countered this by saying the reason Christians can not avenge ourselves, even when we suffer terrible tragedies, is specifically because we believe that God will avenge us. That this is why there is a doctrine of hell. This is why there is a doctrine of the last day. This is why God is still a God of judgment. If we really believe that, then we won't have to go out and avenge ourselves even when people do terrible things to us. And Wolf would have pointed us to a passage like the one we find in Romans 13, where Paul says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, because in so doing, you cast coals of fire upon his head. Paul thinks we are enabled to be a nonviolent church, specifically because God is rightly violent. And so Should we bless our enemies and all these things? Yes, but there's no conflict with this text and the scene that we have here in the book of Revelation, because when we have people committing terrible tragedies against the church, or terrible tragedies against the spread of the gospel, and the state refuses to render justice, then we look to God to render justice. We don't take it upon ourselves to do it, but we must have confidence, first of all, that God is a God of justice and does still traffic in the business of judgment, and that will enable us to be the nonviolent church that Christ has called us to be. It's an interesting answer that is given to the martyrs, that the end will not come until enough Christians get martyred, right? And I don't mean to be reductionistic, but it appears that there's a kind of a quota. This many Christians have to die for their faith, and then the end will come. Well, Revelation is here similar to other ancient Jewish apocalypses, but also different. Here's a Jewish apocalypse. It's got an interesting little scene that is similar to Revelation, and I just want to read a little excerpt from it. He answered me and said, "Do not be in a greater hurry than the Most High. You indeed are in a hurry for yourself, but the Highest is in a hurry on behalf of many. Did not the souls of the righteous in their chambers ask about these matters, saying, how long are we to remain here? And when will the harvest of our reward come?" And the archangel Jeremiel answered and said, "When the number of those like yourselves is completed." So in the Apocalypse 4th Ezra, there's this notion that enough people have to die and then the end will come. Well, Revelation, it's more specific than that. Christian blood has to be spilled. Enough Christians are killed and then the end will come. The implication of the divine response to the petition from the martyrs indicates the necessity of suffering in the plan of God. For more Christians must yet die before the end can be inaugurated. Christian suffering does not hinder the fulfillment of the eschaton. The eschaton is the end period, the kingdom. But it refers, rather inevitably leads to its inauguration. Now, this is just like Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, and he makes some comments that are commonly misunderstood. Jesus has two columns. He says, these are the things that are not signs of the end, and these are the things that are signs of the end. You'll hear this misquoted all the time. When he says false Christs, wars, rumors of wars, he says, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. In other words, those are not signs of the end. I mean, how many times have you heard people say, Jesus says there's going to be wars and rumors of wars in the end? That's not what he says. He put that in the column, stated explicitly, these are not signs of the end. He even puts earthquakes on that list, that there are earthquakes in various places. He says that is not a sign of the end, right? But then in verse 9, Jesus shifts in the discourse and he starts to give the signs of the end. And the first thing he says is, you'll be delivered into tribulation. He's talking to his disciples, and they'll deliver you into death. Of all the things that Jesus says to watch for as actually being symptomatic of the end, he talks about spilt Christian blood and Christian suffering more than any of them. Well, in Revelation, it's the same way. It's the blood of the church that drives the world to its destiny, that drives things toward the end. That is the main sign of the second coming in the Gospels and in Revelation. And as we've seen in Paul, it's the great apostasy, which inevitably will involve some Christian suffering, and the revelation of the Antichrist, which of course now is going to coincide with Revelation and what Jesus had to say, because the Antichrist will kill Christians.